All right, folks. Welcome, welcome. Uh, I thought the lights would come on by themselves and they did not. So just 1 second, I'm gonna go turn the lights on real quick. That's better. How's everybody doing this morning?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Doing good, Brandon. Doing good, man. Uh,
Sorry I missed the previous lectures.
no, you're good. I hope you're able to stay caught up with everything that's recording and uh, it's a tricky game we play, balancing all the things that going on in our lives.
Oh,
Uh,
for sure.
yeah, it's good to see you. Good to see Tom. Yeah, so you guys might not all be in a place to turn your cameras on. If that's the case, I completely understand. If you do feel comfortable with that, I always like that a little bit better just because I feel like people are with me. Um, but to get started, Brandon, since we got you, man, would you mind just doing a quick introduction? Just who you are, what you do, why you're here, and all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brandon Perry and living here in the Metro Phoenix area, the Valley of the Sun. So we're approaching 100 probably within the next week or so. And let's see, this is my second year in the program, married for we're going on 11 years now. And we've got two kids, one who just finished preschool, first year of preschool. Really proud of her. And then our oldest who is finishing up first grade. And yeah, just excited to be here.
Well, awesome, man. Yeah, we're glad to have you, and glad I got a chance to do an introduction with the class. We're 100% present
Yeah.
today, 100% fine. Uh, I rolled in this morning. I was like, did I forget something? Or better yet, my honest thought was, did I put a wrong date in the syllabus? Because that feels like the most likely scenario when I show up here and I'm by myself. But I'm good with this. One of the things that I want to make you guys aware of is that the presentation schedule is now available. I had posted that earlier and realized this morning, actually right before I came in, that I had forgotten to make that folder visible to the class. And so many buttons to click, and I forgot to click the most important one. But that presentation schedule is available following up the midterm exam. If you have any questions about that, please let me know. And if we need to make adjustments, then we can work together to make that happen. But we have that out. Um,
Dr. Brown, what folder is that in? I'm not saying it on.
it should be in presentations. Let me make sure. Let me make sure I made it available on your end. Also have two different shells. It wasn't available. It was available in one and not the other. I'm really looking forward to Canvas because Blackboard's good. You know, it's kind of like people are like, "Hey man, you want to go snowboarding?" I'm like, "Why would I do that?" Because I know how to go skiing. And so learning something new doesn't sound amazing the older I get. But Canvas doesn't have all these quirks to where um, you are more susceptible to mistakes. It's just a lot more user friendly. So decided to make that transition. You should see that now, Tom.
Yep, I can see it. Thank you.
You bet. Okay, so that's available. Both recorded lectures are available if you haven't gotten a chance to watch those. We're going to finish up the last 4 or 5 slides from lecture 4 during today's discussion. Yesterday, my recording of lecture 4, it was pure chaos. You could probably tell that I was on my phone, and if you couldn't tell, I was also in my car. Um, just kind of in between all of the different things that yesterday brought to the table. So Didn't quite get all the way through that lecture, but we're pretty dang close. And then lecture 5 today is a little bit shorter, so we'll definitely get into that in preparation for our midterm, which is tomorrow. Okay, before I start any more lecture material, are there any questions that you guys had from lectures 3 and 4? Covered a lot on information, covered some topics on information asymmetry and Akerlof's paper on the market for lemons. Also discussed some signaling, and ways to deal. Yeah, go ahead.
So I've got a question, and maybe I just didn't fully understand some of the, I guess, the more fine details. Anyway, so I know in the beginning of, I think it was lecture 3, you were talking about like when there's high variation between price to quality. I guess I wasn't quite clear on, do we assume or do we predict that it will increase demand or reduce demand? Because we were saying that we would likely want to increase our, like, the probability of making an efficient decision, so we would like increase our search. But when we talked about credence goods, you're saying that variation in outcomes would lead to consumers like decreasing their demand, or yeah, so I wasn't sure on how the demand for search increases or decreases with variation, and if that's different between credence goods and just, yeah, that whole world.
Yeah. So good question. When we're thinking about search in and of itself, right? Search is going to be more beneficial in circumstances where there is a lot of variation between the price quality relationship, right? In some products or services, I might have a really good positive relationship between price and quality. I'm getting what I'm paying for. In other circumstances, it might not be as positive of a relationship, right? And so if I can more accurately identify products and services where the price is justified by the quality, then that makes search significantly more beneficial, right? We'll have a better allocation of resources from engaging in search activities. Now, when it comes to credence goods, because it's very difficult to verify quality based on complexity or opaqueness of the price quality relationship, we still might engage in search, but we're probably going to have to depend more on signals than on the true characteristics of price and quality, right? And so, when we're dealing with credence goods, it's likely a marketplace where there is, unless it's heavily regulated and established, right? There likely is a lot of variation between price and quality. Again, we'll use financial advice as our example. Okay, so lots of people holding themselves out as advisors, lots of different credentialing, educational experience across the people participating in that marketplace, and probably price variation too, but maybe not price variation that correlates nicely with the quality that we're receiving. And so I have some potential opportunities to allocate my resources inefficiently if I choose a provider that charges a high price for low quality, right? And I might not know because I'm dealing with a credence good. So in my search, again, I'm giving you a really long answer, but I want to make sure I'm clear here. In my search, I'm probably more dependent on signals than I am the true characteristics of price and quality related to the service or product that I end up engaging with, right? And so that's why we have to think about, okay, well then what are my good signals that help me substitute efficiently in the absence of my ability to truly nail down price quality relationship. Okay. And so signals should be a good way to create some differentiation in an efficient manner across the options that are available in a marketplace. If I'm targeting high quality signals, if we don't have enough sophistication in a given area, the biggest risk with signals as a substitute for objective search characteristics, price and quality being those characteristics, then I might key on the wrong signals and still make an inefficient allocation. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Can I ask then, just to clarify, when we talk about the difference between high price to quality correlation versus low, are we, in that framework, are we assuming that the consumer is able to know beforehand, like, hey, I am going into a high price to quality correlation market, or, oh, I know that I'm going into a low price to quality correlation like market, so I need to do more like, are we assuming, yeah, this consumer is able to know that the difference?
I would assume at some level they know. Now they may not be like, all right, I almost talk about it like a robot. Like, okay, I'm really sophisticated and I can say when I participate in this area of the market, then I need to be dependent on search. But when I look at this area of the market, then I need to be dependent on signals. And probably not to that extent, right? But people probably recognize varying levels of comfort and discomfort when starting to evaluate alternatives in different markets, right? And so if someone goes into the market for financial advice, the more likely outcomes are like, I don't know, they all look the same, or whatever the case may be. And so they'll figure out pretty quickly if they're going to be able to, and it's probably more subconscious than conscious, pretty quickly whether or not they're going to be able to really focus on price and quality, right? If I'm looking at houses, I can look at the price of a house and I can look at the quality of a house compared it to other houses in that price range, and it's pretty clear the difference, right? But if I'm looking at something that's a little bit more difficult to ascertain those characteristics, then again, that's where I might get more uncomfortable and either say, hey, listen, I can't participate in this market because it's too risky. I might make a bad choice. Or I've got to take a shortcut because being fully informed is too complex. All right, Innocent, what's up?
Thank you, Professor Browning. Sorry for not attending the class in person today. Yeah, a couple of questions. When I plotted the figures on one of the slides for the perfect information frontier, I got a positively sloped line with perfect correlation. Am I to assume that when we talk of the perfect information frontier is the same as a perfectly positively sloped line with between price and quality? Is that correct? My second question will be, can we draw a line between licensing and certification? I'm not clear on that. I read one of the articles which tried to draw a line between the two, but I'm not sure I really understood what the author was trying to say. Can we draw a line between the two? Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We think theoretically about the perfect information frontier. We're going to have that perfectly positively sloped line that we observe. Right, for basically saying for every unit of price increase, there should be a pretty close to equal unit of quality increase. And so we have that relationship. I'm definitely going to talk about the differences between licensing and certification. That'll be the first thing that we cover in today's lecture. So thanks for highlighting that. All right, Kathy, what you got?
Good morning, Dr. Browning. Mine was just a comment on what Nick mentioned. Well, clients have a very difficult time differentiating price and quality association, simply because some of the credence goods require the client to have some kind of knowledge, which means the client might be, it would be more beneficial if the client had domain knowledge. Therefore, this is when we come to it depends. If the client does have knowledge, then the search will increase the probability of them being able to reach out to a signal that is positive to what they're looking for. For example, many times when we look at human capital theory, we are always looking at, okay, it will increase the efficiency, the productivity of the individual. But when we look at signals, for example, having a CFP, CFA, ACC, whatever credential a practitioner might have, the difficulty that the client might have is associating the efficiency and the knowledge that they're trying to acquire from that specific person. So sometimes signaling is great, but it doesn't necessarily translate to efficiency. So that's where sophistication of knowledge comes in, which many times clients don't have that specific domain industry knowledge to be able to discern how to proceed with choosing an advisor. That was just my comment.
No, thank you. That's a great comment.
Yeah.
Now, I think that you bring up a really nice point in that, you know, credence goods are going to be different for different people, right? Auto repair is a credence good for me, but for you, it might not be, right? For some, the market for financial advice might be a credence market. For some, it might not be. And so when you really get to domain specific human capital across markets, we have to recognize that that's going to be different for different consumers. More markets might generally have more search good characteristics, or more experience good characteristics, or more credence good characteristics, but depending on your level of experience and expertise in a specific area, it will certainly affect where an individual or household lands on a decision by decision basis. So good stuff.
Can I ask one follow-up? Given our discussion so far, is it fair for me to try to distill this and say that there are really kind of two levers whenever we need to make a decision, or maybe it's a continuum, I'm not sure. But on one hand, like there is, information search we engage in, and on the other hand, or on the other end of the spectrum, we would say there's signaling. And is it fair to say that, if we have less human capital, or I don't know, whatever reasons, then we would need to engage more in looking to signals, and there are some times where we would just opt out if we can't get a clear signal, or if we, the information search is too difficult for whatever complexity, opaqueness, or whatnot. Is that fair that those are really kind of our two levers to pull when we're trying to make a quality decision, that we're going to rely on signaling or search? Or is there another kind of area or domain that I'm not, like a triangle or something, that I'm trying to think through?
No, I mean, I like the analogy that you're drawing there. I might put it more on a continuum to where you would say, hey, listen, you have really efficient search, and all the way down from efficient search on the other end of that spectrum, I would probably say naive heuristics, right? Where it's just like, this is just right all the time, or my neighbor said so, or whatever the case may be, which you could classify as signals, right? But as you work it on up, right, naive heuristics, to low quality signals, to high quality signals, to right on down that line to really efficient search. So yeah, I think that's a really fair way of thinking about that. And based on our sophistication, we'll probably choose, or not probably, we will choose somewhere along that spectrum. Or as you noted, Nick, if the uncertainty feels too high to a risk-averse individual or household, then that's when they choose not to participate, right? We could draw a parallel to this in investing in equities. Right? When we look at why do people not participate in the equity market, theoretically speaking, a lot of time we can tie that to a level of risk aversion, like they choose to opt out of the equity market because the variation in outcomes that they might experience be too high. And basically what they're admitting in that decision is I don't have the search skills to come in and reduce that variation. And so the best option for me is to not participate at all.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. Innocent, I see your hand up again. What's up, my man?
Yes, just the last one. I've been thinking about the principal agency theory. I want your opinion on this. The financial planning space is a broad space. Do you think it's an appropriate, assurable lens to look at that domain through? I'm struggling in that my basic understanding of the principal agency theory is that there is some level of delegation, but in our space, people sometimes don't consult advisors because they want to delegate their decision making. They just want an opinion. So I'm struggling to see whether that theoretical framework will be an appropriate one to look at our domain, the financial planning domain. I wanted your personal opinion on it, if you don't mind, Professor.
Yeah, so I'll give you an answer, and if I don't answer perfectly what you're trying to ask, please stop me or follow up, okay? So yeah, I mean, when we look at the principal agent theory, or really just agency theory in the context of financial advice, right? The basic application is this recognition that there's information asymmetry, right? And the information asymmetry favors the advisor, not the client, right? In other words, the advisor is the sophisticated, the client is the naive. Okay, so a big crux in that is that the assumption is that we are all utility maximizing entities, right? So the advisor's objective is to maximize utility, and the consumer's objective is to maximize utility. And so that's a conflicted interest. And the agency issue arises when in this conflict, the sophisticated has the incentive and the opportunity to take advantage of the naive, right? And so when we're applying this to the client advisor relationship, basically what we're suggesting is absent checks and balances that because of the conflicted interest to maximize one's own utility, and because of the asymmetry of information that produces the incentive and opportunity, the advisor is likely to extract rents, right? The advisor is likely to charge a price that doesn't match the quality because they have no incentive to provide the highest level of quality for a given price, because the client would never know the difference. Okay, and so in that, checks and balances through regulation and oversight help better align those interests and bring a little bit more of a beneficial relationship that produces quality outcomes for both parties, and therefore incentivizes at a higher level good advisors to participate in the presence of an agency conflict, and good clients to consult with those advisors to delegate financial decisions for improved outcomes. So that's what I think you asked me, but if I'm wrong, help me out.
So maybe a bit of information here. So if we take shareholders and a manager, Yeah, for me, that is it's clear in my mind that there is a principal agency relationship here. Yeah, one is delegated to act on the behalf of the other person. Yeah, in the financial planning or advisory space, it could be just a one-off, a kind of a consultation. I'm just looking for opinion. I'm not asking you to place trades, to recommend investments for me. So my struggle is, can we always say that there is a principal agency relationship with every bit of financial advisor client relationship kind of that is my struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say in your specific example, right, the principal agent conflict is significantly reduced, if potentially completely eliminated. And the reason for that being is because there's no compensation to the advisor in that case, right? And so if I'm the advisor in that scenario, I may not have a principal agent conflict, but I also don't have a whole lot of motivation to provide you with the best guidance, right? I can give you opinion, but I'm not going to spend any time doing due diligence. I'm not going to research alternatives. I'm not going to do any of those things because it's an inefficient allocation of time to do so, unless it's going to lead to something that is revenue producing that ends up increasing the resources I have available to maximize my own objective. And so in that case, right, there's not a conflicted interest because the advisor really doesn't have an interest. The only person that has an interest is the client. And so in that relationship, I would say that agency at a bare minimum is reduced pretty significantly.
Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good. I'm enjoying this conversation. You guys have anything else before we jump in today? All right, cool. Well, let's take a look at lecture 4 again. I'll get us. I did all this. I should have clicked it before I opened it up, huh? I was watching the video yesterday to see if it was
Hey,
okay.
Professor Browning, looks like Justin needs back in the room. Oh,
Okay. Yeah,
in
no
the
problem.
Zoom. Or wait, Justin, you in?
He maybe was on a different audio device or something like
Oh,
that.
okay.
There we go. I think I got it. Justin, you good? May have asked you already. All right. I see everybody. Okay. I was watching this, just so you know, on these Zoom recordings, if you haven't realized already, you can watch them faster. Have you done that before? To where you speed up the pace. That's pretty awesome. I'm just saying. If I was doing, you guys probably already do this. I'm out of the loop. But I would turn on my voice recognition on my AI, and I would speed that bad boy up and play it through and tell AI to give me all the key points out of my lecture for my study. That's what I would do. I'm just saying. And then I would have a lecture, notes, and some AI generated high points from the lecture for study. Okay, so Innocent asked a good question. Help me understand the difference between licensing and certification. All right, so in a nutshell, I'm going to give you the difference. And we'll talk about more things, but I'm going to give you the main differentiator right off the top. With licensing, the barrier to entry is the highest, right? It's the most strict mark from an entry perspective. And so licensing is going to do the best job restricting low quality providers into a marketplace. Right, in the lecture yesterday, I talked a lot about human capital, and what is innate and what is acquired, right? And so licensing generally requires the highest level of innate human capital to meet the acquisition cost of the acquired human capital, right? I've got to be pretty smart to become a doctor. And so if you're pretty smart and you can see it all the way through to become an MD, that is going to limit at the highest level who can participate in that marketplace. Now, there are licenses that have a lower barrier to entry than does becoming a medical doctor. But for whatever field we're looking at, to participate in that field, licensing generally sets the highest bar for entry. And there's no way to enter a specific segment of that market without that license. With certification, the producer or the seller has more choice with regards to human capital investment, right? There are more levels in which we can enter the marketplace under the certification umbrella. And just to set the stage for this, I'll give you two examples. The CFP is a certification, okay? Licenses are generally established and administered by states. That's the most common setup, right? So you have to be licensed in a state to practice with a license in a specific field. And so the regulation and oversight for licensing is also the highest because of that being the case. But the CFP is a certification. It's not a license, right? The CPA is a license. The license to practice law is a license administered by states. Now, another certification is the CRC, the Certified Retirement Counselor. Raise your hand if you've heard of the CRC. All right, so I'm not seeing any hands go up. Nope, no hands. All right, so Certified Retirement Counselor is another certification. And so you've never heard of it because we don't talk about it that much. But it represents a different level of human capital investment for entering the marketplace for financial advice that should signal to the client what that individual brings to the table in terms of an advice relationship, right? The CFP is what we like to think of as the gold standard for certifications in the advice marketplace, right? It's in depth, it's comprehensive, it has an education and an experience and an ethics and an exam requirement. It requires a pretty high level of human capital to be able to participate under that mark. The CRC, I took it when I was in school. I studied zero. It was about a 1-hour exam, and I passed the exam and got my CRC certification. Now, I just wanted to see if I could pass it. I didn't care. And so I never put that with my name or anything like that. But a very different level of human capital investment. CRC is very pointed towards Social Security and Social Security distribution strategies and all that kind of stuff. Very complex stuff for certain circumstances. And so I'm not saying it's not valuable, but to get it, the human capital investment was definitely different. So the seller or the producer can choose the level of human capital investment that they want based on the certification that they decide to pursue. And this certification should provide a signal. Now, no offense, all right? I've never seen any of your business cards. And so don't get upset with me if I inadvertently use you as an example, all right? But if I'm a consumer, and I've used this already in class, right? And somebody hands me a business card that says CFP on it. And another person hands me a business card that says CRC on it, followed by 3 other sets of letters. Right, so now I've got 4 sets of letters, one of which is a CRC, and I've got another that is just a CFP. The naive consumer looks at both. What is their ability to understand the signal that the certifications are providing in terms of making a choice with regards to who to work with? That's a question, right? Can they interpret the signal in those 2 scenarios differently?
I'll say it would be difficult for them to do so.
Very difficult, right? Very difficult. If I don't have domain-specific human capital enough to know the rigor associated with the CFP in comparison to the rigor associated with other letters behind someone's name, then I'm gonna have a hard time distinguishing between the quality of those signals. And what I might naively do, to Nick's question earlier, is use a simplifying heuristic and say more letters equals more quality, right? Now, I don't know what the other letters are, but I would say if we're just looking at the 2, that the CFP is a better signal of quality than the CRC. Okay?
But how would you know that though? Like if you're a consumer, like how would you know? Like you wouldn't, right? And is that why the CFP does the advertising that we do to reduce the cost of search?
Yep, that's the big goal, right? Is really helping the consumer understand the level of human capital investment and what that translates to in a client advisor relationship by doing that advertising campaign for sure. I love my favorite commercial the CFP ever did was the one where the 2 guys that look basically identical were sitting in a high-rise office in a metropolitan area. Who knows what city it was in? Nice office, nice suit and tie, all that kind of stuff like that. Client walks in, they have a conversation, and then the CFP board basically puts like a stamp of CFP on one of them, and the other one rips the suit off and is a drummer in a rock and roll band, right? The signals, the only differentiating signal in that commercial was the CFP, right? That's the point that they're trying to drive home. And if you're not looking for the right signal, then you might not make a good choice. Now, I'm speaking again, very theoretically. I am not suggesting that it's not possible to get very high quality advice absent the CFP. But for the consumer, this should be a very high quality signal of quality in the advice marketplace. Okay, and because of that, for the producer, they ought to have a lot of incentive to get the CFP, right? Even if I'm a high quality provider, I want to gain more market share, more quality clients, better trust in my relationships, all that kind of stuff like that. I could be a great advisor, right? But I would still have an incentive to get a CFP because the marketplace associates those letters with high quality, which should drive more demand in a complex marketplace. And so both parties are incentivized by the mark.
Curious, kind of in this world, and maybe this is out of the scope of the class, but I wonder how much or what your thoughts are on like the CFP board and trying to protect what the CFP credential means, because I remember whenever I first came onto campus, my mom and my stepdad had come and they were looking at different flyers in our building, and one of them said CFP, but it wasn't a certified financial planner, it was a charitable or something financial planner. And so there's even more mixed, kind of signals when it's like, well, I'm a CFP, but I'm a charitable financial planner, not a certified, right? So anyway, I'm just thinking, do doctors like in the medical field, do they say no one can have an MD after their name unless it's a, protected medical doctor, right? And instead of like a master data science guy or something.
Yeah, that's good. What you just said is news to me. What I do know is You know, the CFP is a registered trademark, right? So if you see a CFP holder with those letters behind their name, they've got the R stamp right there associated with those CFP letters. And so from that perspective, I don't think you can hold yourself out with the letter CFP behind your name if you weren't actually a board registered certificate holding that mark. Now, there, and I don't know, Nick, I'm making stuff up right now, but it's an attempt to make a good guess. When we see something like charitable financial planner or something like that, that's probably more associated with like just thinking about our program, like a certificate track. And so I have a certificate in charitable financial planning, which abbreviates to CFP, but I would never put CFP behind my name with that certificate because I wouldn't have the ability to do so.
Oh, okay. Good to know.
Yeah.
Rob,
But-
can I ask, you've been in this space for quite a bit. Do you have any research out there that tells us why people are looking for the CFP? Is it more of a signal kind of investment or human capital investment? Do we have any research out there that you can discuss?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that we see in the research side of the CFP is research on outcome experience by those working with CFPs, right? And so in comparison to alternatives, people are happier. Their financial well-being measures out higher. And it's tied to objective things, right? They have higher wealth, higher savings for major long-term goals, less debt, better risk protection, right? We can objectively measure those things across the board. And we see that the objective things produce the subjective benefits, right? Happier, more fulfilled, sleep better at night, higher levels of financial well-being because all the other things are objectively better. And so there's research on that for sure. As far as the motivation at the root, either to become a CFP or to seek a CFP, there's a lot of research that basically suggests that decision is solely based on domain-specific human capital, right? I pretty much only seek CFPs if I understand that a CFP is what I need. Or on the producer side, I am more likely to pursue a CFP if I understand the benefits associated with carrying that mark. And so for producers, the biggest objective measurable benefit is average compensation, right? The average compensation of a CFP is much higher than the average compensation of people without a CFP, even if they have other marks. Now, timeout, pause. The distribution is more skewed for non-CFP holders, right? And so what I mean by that is, you know, if I hold a Series 7, no certification, et cetera, there's going to be a lot more of the population that's at the lower end of the distribution, right? And so we have a skewed distribution with a right tail where the tail is long, right? There are less people that make a boatload of money, but the people that make a boatload of money make a boatload of money, significantly more than what the high end of the distribution of the CFP generally is going to produce, right? So that's the other side of the equation as well. Gave you probably more than you were asking for there, but the objective measure to pursue, again, is average compensation. And if I can see that there's a benefit from my own interest in self-maximizing, then that would be my motivation for pursuing.
Yeah, I'll hop in and add, you know, as a leader, right? Someone who hires financial advisors, when I look at, you know, across the population, if I have someone that has a CFP, my compliance if it makes sense. My compliance alert goes down a little bit because I know if you have a CFP, I feel at least you have the education that you're not going to blow a client up. You're hopefully not going to do stupid things when it comes to basic financial planning. So, this is me, not necessarily the firm, but when I'm hiring, if I can look for CFP, then like, all right, hopefully you have at least the knowledge. And again, kind of just think about the risks to clients, right? Sometimes you get people from they just want to sell products, wherever the case may be, to maximize their income. At least the CFP, they have that overview. Hopefully, they have that fiduciary standard of care that the CFP is going to hold them accountable to as well.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, one of the things that we would definitely look at, and we'll see this. I can't remember who has this paper, but there's a job market paper as part of our presentation list. But the paper is really about signaling, right? And so when you think about signaling, one of the things that an individual entering a marketplace as a producer wants to do is they want to signal well to the people that would be hiring them to pay them money. And so I think that's a really relevant point with regards to why someone might choose a CFP, because it leads to more efficient paths to quality employment opportunity. Okay, so now we have some differentiation in the certification market. If you recall yesterday when we were talking about licensing, one of the negatives of licensing was that the barrier to entry could be so high that it would lop off entire segments of the market where there might still be demand to be a producer, and there might still be demand to be a client if there were more variation in the alternatives to participate in that industry. Well, certification allows for that, right? We can have a really rigorous certification, and then we can have certifications of lower rigor. And if the client, so this is the big assumption, right? If the client or the consumer could tell the difference between the human capital associated with the different tiers for each certification, then they could optimally choose a service provider that provided the desired level of quality at the desired price, right? Certification theoretically allows for that. Now, practically, certification, what I've experienced in my observation, tends to muddy the water more than delineate the marketplace, especially absent really good regulation and some client sophistication. So something to note right there between what theory would suggest and what we observe in the market, we have a pretty big interference. And the interference is generally domain-specific human capital, right? I'm not equipped enough to understand what each certification really means when making a decision to participate. Okay, and again, just like licensing, certification is most effective when it is more costly to lower quality sellers, right? So this is what's really interesting, and I'm going to take a break after this comment, and I'll try to keep it relatively brief. Again, just think about this market for financial advice. At some level, because the barrier to entry is low, right? Really and truly, if my wife, who has a degree in elementary education, wanted to say, hey, listen, I'm going to start charging people for financial advice. Not selling product, but I'm going to start providing financial advice, and I'm going to earn compensation through the advice that I provide, whether it be on a YouTube channel or a blog or a vlog or whatever the case may be. Or if she hangs a sign on the door and says, if you want to be my client, I'll give you advice. She could do that today, right? And if people bought what she was selling, she could be compensated for those activities today with zero training, zero certification. The barrier to entry is low. Okay. Now, there's also people that want to enter this marketplace that have very high levels of human capital that cross a pretty high threshold to be a participant. Okay. Now, the problem with either the low or non-existent barrier to entry is my incentive is to enter the marketplace at the lowest cost possible. Because if the consumer can't tell, then I can charge a price disproportionate to the quality that I provide, right? So we have an incentive to do that. And we see some people taking advantage of that incentive, and we don't have a good mechanism for preventing them to do so, right? And the reason we don't have a good mechanism for preventing them to do so is because people are naive enough not to understand the importance of queuing on quality signals. So what that does at the end of the day, again, is it increases that variation in potential outcomes that we might achieve because there's high variation in the price quality relationship, and it may reduce demand through decreased trust. So that's the market at some level we live in financial advice as it relates to certifications or even the lack thereof. Okay, let's stop right there and let's take a break. I've got us at 10:02. Let's just meet back at 10:10 and we'll continue our discussion on this stuff.
So we just got our assignments today for our class presentations.
Okay.
Given tomorrow we have our midterm, Kathy and I go on Thursday, Nick and Brandon go on Friday. Is there an opportunity that you could open up the midterm today to give us more time to both work on our midterm and our presentations?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll open that as soon as we're done with class today.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. No problem. All right. Let's jump back in here and continue looking at certification and wrap this lecture up. Does that sound good? Excellent. All right. So advantages of certification, right? This should definitely increase competition within a profession, right? In other words, people providing like quality should be competing with other people providing like quality. And so our incentive with certification, if this is true, is to really provide the highest level of quality possible within a certain segment of the market. Okay, if I'm competing with other CFPs, I got two characteristics that I can compete on. I can compete on price and quality, but the human capital required is consistent for all. And so if I want to drive more business, I got two choices. I can drive down my price. That's going to be tough, right? Because everybody's providing high quality. And if I want to maintain the quality standard and charge a lower price, my margins are going to get thin. And so my much bigger incentive is to drive quality as high as I possibly can for the clients that I serve so that I can charge the price that is most associated with that level of quality. So it increases competition that moves a segment of the market forward. Okay, now again, speaking theoretically, that may not actually be true. It also encourages professionals to obtain the optimal amount of human capital based on their preferences and goals. And consumers should have more choice with services at different price levels. Okay. Now, again, we see some contrasting examples when we look at mechanics versus doctors, right? The medical profession, again, has very strict licensing requirements. And generally speaking, it's pretty easy to distinguish at a pretty high level of detail the differences in quality in medical providers based on their credentialing. Mechanics is a little bit harder, right? And so we have a little bit more price quality variation and a little bit more dysfunction in that market as well. Now, if you're an expert on the medical field and you're like, dude, you have no idea, I would believe you. But when we look at it from an optics perspective, as it relates to regulation, there's definitely a different setup with regards to those two industries. Now, certification should also limit behavior, right? To Justin's point earlier, right? I like to hire CFPs because I feel more confident in the behavior that they're most likely to engage in. And the reason that they're only going to engage in specific behaviors is because they have a fiduciary standard that they have to abide by in relation to the certification that they hold. Okay, so licensing and certification should limit behavior to more positive behavior based on the level of certification that exists. And as a result of that, there are better outcomes that usually exist for the client, and the overall value of the signal is improved because it's more valid. Okay. And hopefully the oversight enforces and verifies the adherence to the standards that are set by the certification, right? Absent that, then some of this stuff goes away, right? If we don't have good enforcement that forces compliance, then some of this stuff is less true. But generally speaking, certifications do have good codes of conduct and other regulatory requirements that are consistent with producing these things at a decent level. Okay, we've talked about how the CFP does it, so I'm not going to go back over that again. Now, what are the problems with certification and licenses? We assume that human capital correlates with quality, but information asymmetry still exists, right? And so if financial advice is a credence good and I send out a positive signal through a CFP, does that automatically eliminate the agency conflict? No, because there's still information asymmetry, right? And in a credence market, in the presence of complexity, I could still take advantage at some level and be very difficult to verify. Okay, and so I don't have a perfect alignment of interest with regards to my incentives to provide the highest quality for a given price. Okay. Now, another thing that shows up a little bit as a problem with these things is that there's a big incentive to promote them to reduce competition. Okay. So I can promote my certification. I can promote my CRC. And the reason I'm promoting my CRC at some level is to differentiate myself from the competition, right? So I'm going to reduce competition at some level with other service providers who might be higher quality based on the signal that I'm producing. Okay. And if someone's willing to attach to that signal as a quality signal, then I might attract business when I'm not truly competitive in the marketplace to attract the type of business that I'm bringing to the table. So that's a negative if the consumer can't recognize the quality of the signal. Okay, so certifications and licenses become much more valuable when that is when the consumer's ability to recognize goes up. Okay, so all of this, when we look at licenses and certifications and the requirements to hold a license or certification, and the requirements to practice according to a certain guidelines as a license or certification holder, should lead to science-based best practices, right? And that's where universities come in. I talked about this a little bit in a previous example. Well, it was when I was roasting somebody, right? And I basically said in that roast that if everyone was required, okay, so go with me on this theoretical exam. If everyone was required to have a degree in financial planning to hold a CFP, then they're going to universities that are hiring faculty members that are technically trained in the theories associated with science-based best practices in certain domains. Notice I didn't say practice-based best practices. I said science-based, research-based best practices that are driven by the theory, which represents the optimal, which highlights differentiations from the optimal and identifies interferences, and then works to produce solutions for those interferences so that there can be higher quality, more consistently provided in a marketplace, right? That is what I mean by science-based best practices. And so if everyone is aware of that based on their training in their educational component, then we are elevating how people think about the good or service they provide in the marketplace, and ultimately how they deliver as a producer in that marketplace. And so that's a really, really big deal associated with educational components that are focused on science-based best practices in relation to a license or a certification. All right. So again, what I just said in a really long story is we can restrict conduct to what is empirically verified. Okay, remember our role as a scientist is to be objective and to test things in relation to a theoretical expectation. And when we do that, we can produce more concrete standards to limit behavior that is more likely, I shouldn't say proven, but it's certainly more likely to be effective. Okay, then we delegate that through our education to ensure that the people operating in the field are experts. And again, this takes place through a good, rigorous academic setting. And the ultimate outcome, theoretically speaking, is it creates more consistent quality of service. I'm gonna give you an example, and then I'm gonna ask for questions because this is the last slide in this lecture. Let's say that I have some pain in my right side, and I go to the doctor, and the doctor says, "Oh man, we need to do an appendectomy as soon as possible." I'm like, "Okay, who does that?" And they give me a list of general surgeons that can perform that surgery. Okay, through the medical training that doctor received to perform an appendectomy, what drove their training? I can tell you right now, science-based best practices is what drove their training. They're like, "Hey man, whatever makes you feel good. If it feels right, do it." No, I mean, we're talking about rigorous testing through science and research that leads to how this surgery is performed. Now, everybody's anatomy is a little bit different. And so once the actual surgery is executed, there is going to be variation in the execution of that procedure. But the process and the procedure for doing that surgery, I can almost guarantee you, will be perfectly consistent across all general surgeons, right? There is a step-by-step process that they follow to minimize the probability of a negative outcome for that surgical patient when performing that procedure. And it is almost guaranteed that that process is uniform across every general surgeon providing that procedure. And so when we talk about in the financial services industry, we can think about the financial planning process as something that's very similar to the example that I'm providing right here. Every client's going to bring different goals and challenges and limitations and biases to the table in the financial planning process. But if when we're providing that advice, if we have the same standards and the same application and process across all clients, even when there's variation in client circumstance, the likelihood of us providing a high quality outcome for the clients that we serve goes up significantly. And that's a product of science-based best practices on how to engage with clients to produce quality outcomes on a consistent basis. All right, so That wraps up lecture 4. What questions do you guys have for me?
I don't know, a question. Like I get what you're saying. I don't know that I agree with it. And the fact that like I just being a practitioner, hiring people, I'll tell you like the last 5 years, probably two of the best people that, or I've hired a lot of great people, but two of the best, like they weren't even in financial planning when we hired them. Right. So if we have to have this criteria that they got to go through education and all the other stuff before they become CFPs, like me, or even get into the financial planning industry. An example of that, like one ran a T-Mobile store, the other one, she ran a Chipotle, right?
Yeah.
So like they were looking at different industries, and I can tell you the impact that they have on clients, the ability to talk to them and reach them. I mean, we got some really smart academic folks that work for us, but like they're just their personality, like they couldn't do what these two advisors can do to actually help clients. So I think long term, yes, like big firms can teach them. So I could teach them financial planning, but I can't teach the innate, like how to connect with clients and how to actually feel with clients and help them in a very meaningful way. So I don't know. I don't know if you have a response to that. You don't have to, but I'm like, I get it, but I like reality. I don't know if it always works.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point, right? I think what we deal with in our industry is a balance between art and science. You hear a lot of people talk about that, right? And a lot of people would say, hey, listen, you got to do all this technical training, and the technical part of your job is going to represent somewhere between 15 and 20% of the value that you bring to the table, and the less technical, more subjective part of your job, the art, is going to represent 80 to 85% of the value that you bring to the table at the end of the day. And so, I think this would be true of any industry. I think my theoretical, justification for the statement that I made is I want the really talented artists in our field to have the exact same background as those that are bent towards more technical experts, right? I want them in their own unique way to be applying the exact same process and standards and all that kind of stuff like that, regardless of whether or not they were innately gifted with the artistic side or not. When you combine the two, you've got a rock star. There's no doubt about it. But I still want them to have the same science-based best practice training at the end of the day. Now, can you go through a board registered program and complete the education requirements and get a CFP? Absolutely, right? And there's a lot of commitment. There's a lot of human capital that goes into that, both innate, you got to be pretty smart to do it, and acquired. You got to apply those smarts to a rigorous process to accomplish that objective. But in my experience, I would argue from the pure theoretical science-based best practice perspective of the educational process, there's a massive difference between, and I'll just speak to Texas Tech because that's where I'm at, right? There's a massive difference in what Texas Tech provides from that perspective and what a certificate program provides from that perspective. And I want to limit the possibility that someone would engage in a behavior because they don't know better. Right? And universities don't perfectly provide a solution to that thing. I mean, I think you could come back to me and say, okay, well, what experience do you have working with clients then? I'd be like, ooh, good question. No. And so, there's definitely a balance, but you can make a pretty strong theoretical argument for something else.
Yeah, and I guess my point is like we need to, as an industry, we need to like open the funnel, if that makes sense, right? Like there is a whole bunch of CFPs out there that look just like me, right? So it's one of those like, all right, look across the firm, like, all right, like a middle-aged white dudes, right? So I just think about like a lot of clients, like they don't want that, right? So it's amazing, like, or how many times as a leader I've had clients like, hey, I want to work with a female advisor, right? And I, look across my years ago, like 10 years ago, my staff, I'm like, I got one. Now, luckily today, like we have a much more diverse, workforce that adds so much more to like the financial planning and the way we can actually help engage clients. So anyhow, like I get what you're saying, but if it's too restrictive, kind of going back to my example before, like we would have never got these two amazing planners if he's like, hey, you got to have this CFP stuff. They're like, man, I'm good. I'm going somewhere else, right? But because we didn't have those and we were able to get them into the firm, now both of them are CFPs. They went through a program, but we just got to make sure that we have get the right people in there to ultimately help our clients and meet them where they're at.
Yeah, no, I think you make a great point. I think everybody at the CFP board would 100% agree with you, and I agree with you. So, I think that there might be an even easier solution to a degree requirement through a university setting and all that kind of stuff like that. I think you could come back and basically say, in the same way that the CFP board says, hey, listen, we recognize that the psychology of financial planning is a big part of how people operate. So that's got to be part of our principal knowledge topics, and that's got to flow through to the exam because it's a big component of how we interact with clients. I mean, I think you could say, hey, listen, there are some key theories that people need to understand. And if they don't understand these theories, they don't understand the motivation in a lot of ways for why we do things the way that we do things. But if we brought just some of that into the principal knowledge topics, it's just eye-opening, right? Because it forces you to think about things in a little bit different way from a motivation perspective on exactly why we do things the way that we do and how they differentiate certain credentials from other segments of the market. And if you can understand those things well, then you're going to be all the better for it at the end of the day. And again, I think through training you can do that, through testing requirements for certifications you can do that. But I'm with you. Restricting entry to a very narrow group could be disadvantageous at this phase of the game. And again, I think we talked about this too, Justin, when I gave the example earlier. If you do it, does it restrict the people who participate, or does it explode degree programs? And I don't know, right? I don't know, but I think we'll get there eventually. You ain't gonna find no CPA that doesn't have a master's degree in accounting, right? You're not gonna find a lawyer that doesn't have a master's degree. I mean, really a terminal degree, the equivalent of a PhD in law. But I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years of evolution in those professions. And so when we get there, I don't know, but I do think at some point in time we'll get there in a way that benefits the profession and elevates the quality of service that we provide without restricting entry to those that could be great service providers in that marketplace as well.
Can I ask a question of Justin? Did you pay for the CFP certification for your two guys you were talking about?
Yeah. So that's what I love about our firm. Like, if you want to get a CFP, like the firm pays for it.
Yes. So for me, it's the same thing. For people out there who don't have the capacity to make that investment, you bring them in, you invest into them. At the end of the day, we standardize the process. I think that is where we want to get to, where the process, the steps we take, and providing advice to our clients is standardized, just like the medical doctors do. So I don't see a problem here. There are minority groups out there who don't have the capacity to make the investment. It takes a lot of money to acquire the CFP. If you think the person have the capacity, you bring them in, you make the investment. At the end of the day, we will end up at the same level of quality of product, and I don't see a problem here, honestly. Yeah.
My argument is a little bit different, but I would like to comment about Justin's just giving feedback. Looking at financial planning industry, as we all know, it's a pretty new industry. So the challenge is in the existence of the fact that we're trying to certify, all of us that are going through the CFP board programs or schools or universities, the path is that we are trained and eventually we will take the exam and will become CFPs. The challenges that pre-exist is the fact that the industry is highly diluted by those that claim to be financial advisors, yet they are not. So they've not been trained initially. And therefore, how I look at what Dr. Browning is saying is when we not necessarily augment, but when we argue for science-based programs or research-based programs, we are trying to bring all these financial advisors, quote unquote, to the same starting line, whereby we are bringing them to a level field whereby we can compete and offer the same value as CFP, rather as CPAs and other professions that have been there for many years. Therefore, how I look at it is leveraging the signals that we send out as we are financial advisors, we are CFPs, and therefore we are not sending confusing signals to our clients whereby if I claim I'm a financial advisor and I'm a CFP, then they ought to know that truly I will always advise them based on their best interest. That's number one. Number two, for Justin's feedback, what we look for even in financial well-being and literacy, red to black, we look for transferable skills. Therefore, we've realized there are many students who would like to help fellow students who are not necessarily trained in PFP or PFI, but they desire to acquire the skills to help each other, to help other families. And what we do is exactly what Justin has mentioned, is bring them into the program, train them in terms of what does financial literacy look like? What does financial education entail? They are not, they will not go through PFP or PFI, but the thing is they are able to have, rather they have transferable skills that they can be able to connect with fellow students or even clients that typically a CFP or myself would not be able to connect with them. Having said that, the profession we are in is mainly based on human relationships. And therefore, any corporation, any client is looking for those people that have transferable skills that can be able to connect with their clients and be able to add value through that connection back to the client will also be a winner, but also the corporation will also be a winner. So there are two ways we can view it. We can view it as for the sake of the best practice of our industry, it is best that we all come to the same level field. But the latter aspect is if there are transferable skills that are evident in a specific individual, how about training them in the fundamentals of what we know and eventually certifying them as Justin has alluded, and that becomes a win-win both in our industry, but also to the client.
Man,
I
Kathy, you
agree.
do like. I'm tired. I think you just demonstrated a little bit of life in you right there. So I'm about to turn this over to Kathy. And I'm gonna just sit here and ask questions if that's all right with you guys. That's great. That's what I love about this class. Just an easy one to kind of talk about different perspectives because I think we all have the same goal. We self-selected into this program. And so fundamentally we generally have the same goal. And I love the different perspectives from experiences on how to accomplish that goal. That's what's great about this, right? We have a marketplace where we have an optimal, we have interferences with the optimal. And so let's sit down and really think through how do we produce solutions that eliminate those interferences to create some consistency that produces high quality outcomes. So love the perspectives. Okay, let's jump into 5. There's only 18 slides in 5, which probably doesn't give you much confidence. You're like, dude, you did 1 slide in our first hour. All right, here we go. Let's talk about some review. What's a valuable signal?
It's something that cost the provider some time and money to gain, and that the consumer can recognize as a signal of quality.
Yeah, good, good. I agree with that.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
it's
Go ahead.
oh,
Go ahead, Nick.
I was just gonna say, yeah, in addition to what Tom's saying, it's hard for the low quality providers to mimic that cost.
Excellent. Yeah, yeah, y'all are both right on, right? Simplest definition that comes to my mind is a signal that's more costly for a low quality provider to uphold, right? So we could say that a warranty is a quality signal. If you're selling crappy stuff and everybody's claiming a warranty on you because you're a low quality sales provider, then that's going to be costly for that low quality provider, right? Or if I've got a CFP that imposes a fiduciary standard and you're constantly operating outside the client's best interest, and you get your CFP revocated by the CFP board, then that's costly to the low quality provider. As to where the high quality provider never has to cash in a warranty because they provide good products, and they never are in violation of their fiduciary standard because they're always putting the interest of the client ahead of their own. So those produce quality signals. Okay, what's the principal agent conflict?
I'd say that's when the agent is entrusted with decision making for the principal, but sometimes their incentives don't align, so they act in their own best interest versus what's in the best interest of the firm or the principal.
Nice. Very good. Anybody have anything else on that one? Yeah, right. We've got a conflict that's born out of information asymmetry, right? Where the agent is the sophisticated and the principal is the naive. And in that relationship, there's an opportunity and incentive for the agent to take advantage of the principal. Very good. Okay, so how do we reduce agency costs? 3 ways.
By providing warranty.
Okay, what would we call that? What's the overarching term for providing something like a warranty?
Is that bonding?
Bonding, good. 2 more.
Monitoring. Oh, sorry,
Monitoring.
Tom.
Excellent.
Then we can also use contracts.
Good. So contracting, monitoring, and bonding are the most common ways of reducing agency costs. Okay. Why would advisors engage in bonding?
It's the signal quality.
Yeah, right. It's a high quality signal. Bonding is basically making myself personally liable for failing to uphold my end of a deal. And so, especially in complex markets, if it's difficult to distinguish quality, and someone says, "Hey, listen, if I don't deliver, I'll take the hit." Right. So that increases trust and increases demand where quality is difficult to ascertain. Okay, so that's why advisors would do something like that. Okay, what is trust? I gave you a basic definition for trust yesterday in our lecture. I'll give you this one. An assumption of alignment of interest. Right? I trust you if I think you are not going to do things to harm me. Right? Or said differently, I trust you if I believe that you will act in my best interest. Okay. Main difference between suitability and fiduciary.
That one was an interesting one for me. My understanding of the lecture of what you said was that the suitability check kind of have a range, and people will stick with the minimum. They won't go to the upper limit. But for the fiduciary, it's kind of a standard something. It's a principle-based something. It's either you are adhering to it or you are not. But for the surability, you have a range. It's a rule-based kind of monitoring, and people can decide to stick with the basic rule. Once I meet the basic requirements, that is okay. There will be no incentive to move to the upper limit, which will require more cost will be involved.
Yeah, good.
I will
Go ahead, Kathy.
Fiduciary is actually based on the best interest of the party that you're advising at this point in time, the client. But as Innocent has alluded to, the suitability is based on standards. As long as I've reached a certain threshold of standards, then I don't have to go above and beyond.
Yeah, good. So, I would say overarching difference, which you guys both described. So you're both right. The suitability is a rules-based standard, and the fiduciary is a principles-based standard. All right, so I'm going to give you an example from the Bible, not because I'm trying to preach a sermon here, but I think it's a good illustration of this, right? So Jesus in the Bible, they come to him as religious leaders who are well studied on the rules that are laid out in the Old Testament of the Bible, right? So there's 613 laws that the Jewish people abided by in their day-to-day lives, and they did these things basically because they thought that this was the way to live according to their belief system, right? And so Jesus was mixing things up a little bit in one of the conversations that he was having. And in the Bible, the religious leader comes to him and says, hey, listen, there's 613 laws. Of all these laws, which is the most important? Okay, so suitability. Of all these rules, I need to uphold them. Like, what rule should I really be focused on if I want to live the right way? And Jesus, in his answer, elevated it to a principles-based standard, right? He said, you can live by the rules. You're never going to be good enough. And so the standard is what I teach, basically, right? He said, the standard I'm going to set for you is love me and love other people with everything you have, right? And so what he's basically saying is, hey, listen, you can work on these rules and that's all good, but you will fulfill all 613 rules if you apply this one principle. Okay, so that's the big difference between suitability and the fiduciary standard, right? We can have all of these rules that come into play, but if we have a standard that is principles-based, that you can overarch all the rules and say, hey, listen, you will have met all of the rules if you apply the standard. But if you ask yourself, have I met this standard? And the answer is no, then you've probably broken a lot of the rules along the way, right? And so it just becomes a really good filter of looking for things through. And so I oftentimes think about that story as a parallel suitability and fiduciary. The fiduciary standard says, hey, listen, we have to put our client's best interest ahead of our own and act in our client's best interest. It's not about all the rules of can and can't. The question is simple. Am I doing that, yes or no? And if the answer is yes, then the actions that I'm pursuing are appropriate. If the answer is no, then I need to go back to the drawing board and consider some additional alternatives because I have not met the elevated standard. So the standard doesn't eliminate the rules. It elevates the rules, right? As to where absent a principle-based standard, our objective is likely to operate at the minimum of the rule to maintain compliance. All right, short review today. All right, so I love this. I think this is a great graphic. Thinking about bounded rationality. So we got a bunch of people going to the gym, getting their workout started by going up an escalator right next to a set of stairs. You would assume that these people who are dressed to work out, carrying a towel, would naturally select the stairs to get warmed up a little bit. But instead, this is a visual representation of some why are you doing what you're doing, some bounded rationality. So when we say bounded rationality, let's set this up. The example that we gave in the very first lecture of class is that people are rational in their pursuits of utility maximization, right? So with perfect information and perfect ability to apply information to make choices, they make choices that are in line with their objective of maximum satisfaction. But we know that it's either impossible or at best not efficient to make perfect choices. And so this violates the economic assumption of perfect information and full rationality. So the question becomes, what limits perfect choice? And we have some pretty big things listed here. This is certainly not an all-inclusive list, but it definitely highlights some of the main things that might limit perfect choice. The first one is cognitive ability, right? If we just look at our ability to make informed decisions, especially when things are complex. We talked a lot about this already, just in a more indirect way. Okay, so again, cognitive ability can be innate or acquired. The lower our cognitive ability, the less ability we're going to have to make perfect choice. The higher our ability, the more ability we're going to have to make better choices. But it's probably still inefficient to make perfect choices. Okay, based on this ability, we've been calling it human capital to this point. It's going to impact our search costs, and we may take shortcuts in the absence of ability to perform efficient search, which is going to limit our ability to make perfect choice. And the shortcuts that we take may very well be based on our biases. Okay, there's a lot of behavioral biases that come into play when making informed choice. And our biases can definitely be impacted by our cognitive ability and our human capital along the way. And so we have these things that are common to human nature that impact our ability to be rational. And so what this creates is a bounded rationality, a limited rationality that contributes to our inability to fully maximize our objective. And so the question that we asked on the first day of class is, if people aren't rational, does this void the usefulness of rational economic models? And we agreed that the answer to this is no, right? Because the rational economic model sets the normative, right? And then we observe something below the normative and we evaluate interferences and come up with solutions to minimize interferences to improve choice. Okay, so what happens when we assume rationality? Well, the biggest thing is that we provide incentives for the sophisticated, not the naive. Because when we assume a consumer's ability to act rational in a resource allocation decision, then we basically ignore or incorrectly diagnose interferences, right? And as a result of that, the marketplace ends up being set up to benefit the sophisticated, not the naive. This is from a policy perspective, okay? So policy, when we assume rationality, will generally have little positive impact on the uninformed, right? If anything, from the naive perspective, policy that assumes rationality will create a bigger chasm between the sophisticated and the naive. Okay. Now, an example that we use here again is tax policy. And so I've used tax policy as an example of equitable policy. And in a lot of cases, the way the tax system is set up in the United States, it is equitable, right? We have a transfer of resources from low marginal utility of additional consumption households to high marginal utility from additional consumption households through the progressive tax system. Okay, but the tax system also, at some level, assumes rationality. It assumes the consumer's ability to understand the tax code and apply the tax code to minimize taxes to the best of an individual or household's ability. Okay, and so what happens under this assumption? Well, the sophisticated come in and they fully, or I shouldn't say fully, but at a much higher level, use the laws and rules associated with the United States tax system to avoid taxes at the highest level. Okay, and the unsophisticated who don't understand the tax code and policy and so on and so forth have less ability to do so. So even though the tax system is progressive, it also has some deficiencies because of assumptions of rationality that are part of the overall tax policy that we observe. I'll give you a couple of examples here. Let's think about the earned income credit. Right, the earned income credit is a refundable credit that's available to households that are below a certain income threshold. And so if those households are aware of the fact that the earned income credit could be highly beneficial and be a big part of their overall income for a given year, then they'll definitely do everything that they need to do to make sure that they capture that earned income credit at its maximum. If they're unaware, however, which is likely, they may miss an opportunity to claim a credit or to maximize on a credit that could be major or have major implications on the resources they have available to them in a given period, right? So that's an example on one side. The example on another side, where we take the sophisticated and we say, all right, how do they use the tax policy to their benefit? Let's consider business owners as an example, right? Business owners generally, number one, hire a CPA. They rent the expertise of a provider in that marketplace, and they work very closely with that individual to take advantage of every loophole that exists in the marketplace. Okay, so as a result of that, they minimize their effective tax rate, even though the amount of income that they're generating in a given year is significantly higher. And so there's some disparity based on rationality in our tax system, even though the tax system is set up to be progressive in nature. Okay. And one of the things that we assume here, right, and I should have touched on this before I went on that long example, is when we provide incentives through the tax code, earned income credit, that the incentive will change behavior. Well, for the sophisticated, sure, it does. If I, as a business owner, understand the incentives that are available through the tax code, then I'm going to take advantage of those incentives to minimize my taxes. But if I provide an incentive through the tax code for the unsophisticated and assume that it's going to change their behavior, I might be wrong, because the unsophisticated do not recognize, because of bounded rationality, the benefits that change behavior could provide. Right, so the tax policy under this set of scenarios has Darwinian characteristics, right? The strongest survive, or the strongest get the greatest benefits. And we see that in line with that, the greatest reward goes to the most sophisticated. So I'll give you an example from my days of working as a CPA. We worked with a client, this was a long time ago. Gross income for a given year, $435 million. Okay, I can't remember what the taxable income of this client was, but the effective tax rate that this person paid based on the incentives that were available through the tax system, was like 7 to 8% effective rate on 435 million. Their overall tax bill, I do remember this, was 27 million. And you might be looking at that from a gross perspective and be like, that person paid 27 million, but again, the effective tax rate in relation to overall income was about 7 to 8%. You can do the math on that. Well, we also did the executive assistant's tax return as part of their employee benefits for this individual. That person made about $80,000 a year. I don't remember what their actual total tax was. We could do the math, but their effective tax rate was like 11%. And so the overall bill was much higher, but the tax code for that person that was sophisticated was set up to reward certain behaviors in the outcome, even in a progressive tax system, was that the most sophisticated paid a lower tax rate than did someone with less sophistication. And I'm not saying that that person was less smart, right? There's all kinds of things that could contribute to that. But it is an example of how tax policy at some level can be Darwinian by providing greater rewards to those that take advantage of incentives at their highest level. Okay, which can potentially result in a more regressive nature of the tax system. But policy can also do go the other way if we're smart enough, right? So Truth in Lending Act that we talked about a lot. Who benefits from the Truth in Lending Act? Well, a much broader percentage of the population, but those that have the lowest level of sophistication still may not change the behavior, even though they have great disclosure at their disposal, right? And those that do have the rationality to recognize the disclosed information, right, about APRs or minimum payments on credit cards, they will change the behavior to their benefit. So the point here is, in the presence of bounded rationality, policy is going to produce different outcomes for different people based on the sophistication that they bring to the decision. Okay? And those that bring the highest level of sophistication are going to get the biggest benefits, and those that are more bounded in their rationality will benefit less. And so anytime we make a policy, it's likely the more we consider the fact that people aren't perfectly rational, but there is some limitation to their ability to make informed quality decisions, the more likely it is that we'll adapt that policy to account for that issue. All right, this is a good place to take a break. So on break, think through any questions or comments that you have. Again, I've got us at 11:03. And so let's, or 11:02, I'm sorry, I read my watch wrong. Let's meet back at 11:10, and then we'll bring this bad boy home for the day. Sound good? Excellent. My bad, y'all. I forgot to pause that recording. So you're gonna have about an 8-minute break in your lecture if you go back to watch this. You'll know once this paternalism slide pops up, just fast forward for 8 minutes. All right. Well, I want to make sure that we get through this in plenty of time to discuss the midterm. So I'm going to go ahead and get rocking in the spirit of that attempt. Okay, so we can write policy, and under policy, people still have pretty high levels of freedom of choice. Or we can take a little bit different approach to behavior and choice, and we can implement paternalistic alternatives. Right? So paternalistic or paternalism is pretty much what it sounds like it is. We're going to limit choice through guided behavior. Okay, so we're going to reduce the likelihood of you choosing poorly. Okay, so we can impose suitability rules under paternalism. Okay, so we can limit products to only those that might do some good, or we can set limits on interest rates for loans. We can make harmful products illegal. All of these things are examples of paternalism. Okay, we're trying to point you in the right direction through restricted alternatives, but still giving you the impression that you have the choice to choose freely. Now, in the good old US of A, one of the things that we highly value as a society is our freedom, right? And if you don't believe that's true, go in and tell just about any American that, hey, listen, you don't have the choice in this matter. We made the choice for you. And no matter how beneficial that choice might be, the majority are gonna be like, don't take away my choice, right? It's part of our nature as human beings, and it's part of our culture and society in the United States of America. So anytime, specifically in the United States, we're generating policy that has paternalistic tendencies, we can't completely restrict choice because it becomes somewhat less effective because of cultural and societal norms. All right. And so we can just think about prohibition as an example of this. Now, whether or not this was a good idea or bad idea, it's an example. So regulation came out in the 1920s that made alcohol essentially illegal. Okay, so I restrict your choice to participate in the consumption of alcohol. What did people do? They created a black market for alcohol, right? They went underground and said, hey, listen, we're going to do whatever we want to do. You can't take our choice away. And so through restricted choice, they might have created an outcome that was worse than what it would have been if the regulation would have been less restrictive. Okay. So again, we can take the tax on tobacco products as an example. You can choose to do whatever you want to with tobacco products. But if you do, just know that you're going to pay for that choice. And so that's a restriction. If people still choose to pay for that choice, then that's great. They did so under the restriction, but the more likely outcome is that people will choose at a lower rate to use those types of products, which we know have harmful outcomes in a lot of cases. Okay, so that's kind of an example of soft paternalism, where we use choice architecture to guide people in the right direction. Soft paternalism, great example, is the way someone sets up a buffet line, potentially, right? I'm going to set that buffet line up in a way that incentivizes you to do what I want you to do. And so if I'm a restaurant that holds myself out as a healthy alternative to different things like that, and I have a buffet option, and I'm going to put all of the salads at the front of the buffet. That's choice architecture. You're going to see that first. You're going to fill your plate up. And then when you get to the pumpkin pie at the end of the line, then maybe you don't choose that because your plate's full and you've already actively chosen other healthy things. And so choosing the pecan pie at the end of the buffet line is a direct contradiction to your other choices, and you're less likely to engage in the negative thing. Okay. That's a great example of soft paternalism. A little bit more firm paternalism are default options. Okay, you can choose to save however much you want to in your retirement plan, but we're going to default you in a 3% rate. Okay, you can come back and say, I'm not going to save anything. You can change that to 6%, whatever you want to. You have all the choice in the world, but we're going to go ahead and set this architecture up to where you automatically participate for your own good. When we do things like this, it improves the welfare of many, right? Even the unsophisticated, because the unsophisticated are less likely to negative elect out of something that they aren't all that familiar with at the end of the day. So we see higher participation rates, higher savings rates, while still preserving the freedom to choose an alternative.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Is it important that we are clear on the difference between soft paternalism versus hard versus like the overarching paternalism? Because the first one, it said we are limiting choice, but then soft is saying we're not limiting choice, and then I think you mentioned hard is we're not limiting, we're just defaulting. So is that really important that we understand the very specific differences between those?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that not necessarily understanding, what the pure definition of soft paternalism is versus hard paternalism, but more that paternalistic regulation is on a spectrum, right? And so we can be very restrictive in our choice through paternalism, or we can be a little bit less or a lot less restrictive and just structure things in a way that put people on a path that we believe is more optimal for the vast majority.
Great, thanks.
You bet. All right, so annuitization in retirement accounts. What would happen in the absence of regulation related to annuitizing a portion of retirement accounts? I'll give you the answer. Nobody's going to annuitize, right? There's a lot of research that suggests that partial annuitization of the retirement portfolio is a very good move for the vast majority. Okay, but even though that's true, without any type of regulation, since we're talking about it here, paternalistic regulation, the likelihood of that happening is not good, right? So if I say, hey, listen, kids, it's pretty important that you have some protein in your diet. And then I'm like, hey, listen, we're doing dinner on our own every night. It's a free for all. You decide what you're going to eat for dinner. What are the chances that my kids are choosing protein if they have unlimited choice? 0, right? There's gonna be a lot of Doritos and powdered donuts for dinner. Now, that's with freedom of unlimited choice. If I put different things in my pantry, I can say you have whatever you want for dinner. That's a little bit more paternalistic. Right? Now they're going to start choosing things that are healthier with what they feel like is freedom of choice, but I've restricted their choice by what's available, right? Or I can say, hey, listen, you can pick whatever you want, but for this segment of your plate, I'm picking your protein, and you have to eat it. Okay, that's what we're talking about here with annuitization of retirement accounts. We know that having protein in your diet is beneficial, right? We know that annuitizing of a portion of the retirement portfolio for the vast majority is beneficial, okay? But if we don't intervene in any way, form, or fashion, then people are not going to annuitize. There's a ton of research that shows that. What would happen if we provided information on the benefits of annuitization in retirement accounts? Who's going to annuitize a portion of that portfolio? Correct. The sophisticated,
Sophisticated.
right? Only the people that can take the information and use that information in a way that informs improved decisions. Okay, so with information, the sophisticated demand it and will act based off of what they learn from that information to improve their outcomes. The unsophisticated will ignore the information, or even if they understand it, will probably hesitate to act to their best interest. What if we defaulted people into the lowest cost immediate annuity with a portion of their portfolio, with the option to opt out?
They would do it.
You'd have almost 100% annuitization with a portion of the portfolio. In not 100% of the portfolio, but almost 100% of people would annuitize a portion of the portfolio with a default, right? So I think you kind of see where we're going with these examples and the impact that regulation can have on the choices that people make and the outcomes that they experience. Okay. Now, paternalism can also be a nice alternative. I'm not suggesting, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying the only option for good regulation is paternalistic regulation. I do not think that's true. But since we're talking about it, paternalism can be more valuable, especially in markets where there are products and services with shrouded attributes. And so when we say shrouded attributes, we're just talking about features of goods and services that are difficult to identify, right? Or that producers intentionally make less salient. They bury to some extent. Okay, so producers have an incentive to hide these unattractive product attributes while promoting the attractiveness. The example that I always like to use here is free checking accounts. I have made more salient the fact that if you open up an account with me, that it's free to do so, right? Maybe there's no minimums, there's no transaction limits, there's all these things that make using this account a free account for setup and use purposes. But if you don't maintain a certain balance, there's a fee. If you go over your deposited funds, there's a fee. So it's not a free account. I highlighted the portion of it that was free to encourage decisions to participate, but I shrouded the less positive attributes of using that account so that you didn't consider those at as high a level in your decision-making process. So with shrouded attributes, the naive will make decisions only based on what's known. The sophisticated will be the only group that looks deeper into that transaction to identify all attributes to make a more informed decision. Okay? And what happens in that case is the naive end up subsidizing the benefits of the sophisticated. All right? So shrouded attributes can be a little bit of a problem. Okay?
Sounds a lot like dating.
Oh, man, great example. Yeah, I definitely shrouded the fact that I was very cheap
Right?
when I was dating my wife, and then I dropped that bomb on day 2 of marriage. Great example. So we can also have add-on shredded attributes, right? So we can say, hey, listen, here's the basic cost of a good or service. All right, and I'm going to make my decision based on the basic cost. But the shrouded attributes are those add-on costs that might be difficult to grasp until you've experienced those add-on costs. And so I make my decision based on a basic cost, and I don't consider the add-ons. We could use cars as an example, right? I love the car and I love the features, and I think about the price of the car. All right. Well, when I buy the car, I don't think about the fuel cost. It's a little bit more shrouded. I don't think about the insurance cost. That's a little bit more shrouded. And the fuel cost and the insurance costs are going to vary based on the type of vehicle that I choose to purchase. I don't think about the maintenance cost. It's a little bit more shrouded. And so we make uninformed decisions based on what is salient and fail to consider the add-on shrouded components of a transaction. Okay, so in this case, there can be low price offerings for the basics, and the firm or the market knows that the naive will ignore the add-ons and make uninformed decisions, to whereas the sophisticated will either limit their participation to only the basic cost and take advantage of the features that they care about the most, or they'll opt out of that market because they'll recognize the true cost associated with participation. Okay. And in a lot of cases, this ends up creating a subsidy. Okay. And we talked about this in the credit card market. We talked about this in Vegas. We could apply this to even the financial services market, right? You keep seeing these firms that offer low to no cost investment products, or these wirehouses, right? And the sophisticated are going to understand, like, hey, listen, if I choose to participate in this, then this is good. And the producer knows that they can subsidize the low to no cost options, because the naive on the backside might be more prone to choosing more expensive alternatives that offset the low cost that the sophisticated are using. And neither has an incentive to change, right? The sophisticated is not going to be like, hey, listen, you're providing me a subsidy. I think you should change your behavior. And the naive is not going to change their behavior because they don't realize they're providing a subsidy. And so when that's the case, how do we protect the naive? Not offering, or not necessarily asking for a solution in that question. It's rhetorical. But we have to recognize that absent us stepping in on the behalf of the naive, that the naive will make inefficient resource allocations, oftentimes to the sophisticated's benefit. So how can we improve the naive decision? Right? Disclosure at point of sale that focuses on salient attributes has proven very beneficial. Okay. Now, when we say salient attributes, we're really talking about those attributes that are easy to understand that impact decision quality. Okay, attributes that are easy to understand and impact decision quality. And so if we highlight those things at the point of sale, the vast majority can grasp that and make a more informed decision. Okay, so very helpful. And I just talked about that. And a lot of times what this does is it focuses on improving understanding the trade-offs between taking one course of action versus another. Okay, so let's think about a financial advice scenario. Okay, you could sit down very easily and say, hey, listen, if you choose this product, the fees associated with this product are this. If you choose this product, the fees associated with this product are this. Based on our return estimations, even though they may be different, if you invest $10,000 over the next 10 years, this is the expected outcome that you would experience based on these two alternatives, right? Both represent good alternatives based on your risk preferences and so on and so forth. Which one do you choose? Well, you've taken a lot of the uncertainty out of that decision, right? And you've made it very clear that there's variation across the two alternatives in relation to the expected value and outcome that one would experience. And that's going to lead to more informed choice, even for people that don't have high levels of sophistication, right? That's easy to understand for the vast majority. And so now we're looking at trade-offs and the understanding of that through the presentation of good salient information, and we end up better off at the end of the day. Now, in some areas, this has proven very effective, and in some areas, there's limited empirical evidence of effectiveness. Okay, I'll go back to annuities. I could sit down with the client and say, hey, listen, here's how annuities may allow you to improve the efficiency of your portfolio, make it last longer and produce higher values, reduce income uncertainty, help secure a bequest, serve as a complement to long-term care. I can go through all of those things, right? And I can focus you on the better outcomes in terms of resource availability and risk reduction based on this decision. But even with that, people be like, so you're telling me with an immediate annuity that there's a way that I would not get back the full premium that I paid in when purchasing this product. Now, annuities have gotten a lot more sophisticated. I understand that. They're starting to address these behavioral biases that a lot of people bring to the table. But in this basic example, you'd be like, that's what I'm telling you. They're like, I'm out. And be like, I thought your objective was resource maximization over the course of your life, right? And I just gave you an alternative that is consistent with your preferences and resource maximization. I didn't realize you cared about your resources as much when you weren't alive to enjoy them. Now, I'm speaking very theoretically. I wrote a paper about this that led to an article really an interview, not an article, an interview that got published on Yahoo Finance cover page. And I got cooked by old folks, right? I mean, cooked. They were writing me emails, they were leaving me voicemails, like, call me back if you want to understand why you're wrong about all of these things. And I was like, hey man, I get it. I'm speaking about this from a rational perspective, and you're speaking about this through the lens of the biases that are a product of your experiences and preferences. We're coming at this from two different angles. And I'm not saying either one of us is right or wrong, but our perspectives are definitely different. And they lead to the way that we think about things. And so even based on this example, when we present good information that helps us understand trade-offs, the effectiveness of this might not be great based on our experiences and behavioral biases. All right. So when we think about our ability to make rational choice, okay, so rational choice involves a comparison of expected utility from alternative. We've said that throughout the course, okay? But we generally tend to focus on more characteristics when making decisions, or more on certain characteristics when making decisions than we do on other characteristics, right? So we deem in our evaluation process some things more important than others. And if left to our own vices, generally speaking, we tend to choose the wrong characteristics, either in part or in whole. Okay. Now, a lot of this has to do with how we envision things. All right. So let's think about a TV warranty when checking out at Best Buy. Okay. I go to Best Buy. I buy a 70-inch TV. I'm excited about it. And the salesperson or the cashier at the checkout says, do you want the extended warranty on this TV? How much is it? $179. You're like, all right, I just paid, let's call it $600 for this TV, right? I'm not getting the OLED stuff, y'all. I'm just a professor. But I paid $600 for the value 70-inch TV, $179 warranty. He's like, yeah, man, I had a guy come in the other day, had to cash this in. Just awkward when he was hanging it, and he dropped it. Thank goodness he had that warranty because we fully replaced that TV. All right, so I'm considering the characteristics of this warranty purchase. One of the characteristics is expensive as crap, right? It represents over a third of the full purchase price of the TV. That is expensive insurance on the front side. Okay. The other characteristic is the TV is not that expensive. Like, third of the price for the TV that I just bought that wasn't that expensive anyway. All right, so I'm considering the cheapness of the TV, the expensiveness of the warranty, and this other salient characteristic that the cashier brought to my table, which was the likelihood that I would need that. Do I want to lose $400? Because now I can envision myself dropping this while trying to hang it with my 16-year-old son, who's proven not that bright. Okay, and so like, oh crap. And depending on how I weight those different characteristics, my decision will be determined by that. And if I overweight the envisioning of the drop TV, then I might make a less than rational decision. If I overweight the cost of the warranty, then that might lead to a different decision, right? So I shouldn't say overweight, if I give more weight to. And so the salient characteristics of a transaction are going to determine how we envision participating in that transaction, which is ultimately going to impact our choice. And so when we think about salience, it's very important from a regulatory perspective that we bring the most relevant considerations for a decision to the forefront in a way, as already been stated in this lecture, that is easiest for the majority to comprehend. And in doing so, we can help the masses make more informed decisions. Okay? Now, another thing that this does is it forces firms to compete on concrete attributes, on the most important things. And so if expenses are one of the most important things in determining the long-term performance of investment products, then firms are now competing on expenses, right? And to the consumer's benefit, because it's required that the expenses of an investment be disclosed in the purchase transaction. And so salient information being brought to the forefront of the decision-making process in turn leads to more competition on the factors that are most important. So regulation from that perspective can be highly effective. Now, if we don't have regulation, right? And firms are now presenting incentives related to attributes that are more favorable to firms, then firms can use those attributes to extract rents. Okay? And so we have to understand that there's an alternative side of this coin as well. One where regulation can be very helpful, another where a lack of regulation can lead to less desirable outcomes, giving firms the freedom to disclose and make salient whatever they think is most advantageous based on their own maximization objective. All right. Now I'm going to go on a quick tangent real quick, and this is going to be quick. One of the things that's really interesting that we started to look at more heavily in the research related to retirement income decisions is the effect of age on one's ability to make effective choice and how that affects regulatory decisions. Okay? So again, when we're thinking about cognitive ability, we have what we call innate ability, and then we have what we call fluid ability. Innate's what we're born with, fluid's what we acquire through education experiences and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's some combination of these two things working together. Bad news, our innate ability starts going down at about age 20. Okay, so we tap out. The maximum capacity that we have with our innate cognitive ability, science shows, is at about age 20. Now, also at age 20, we're inexperienced, uneducated, and prone to making bad decisions due to a lack of those things that will benefit us later in life. Now, from 20 to about our mid-50s, our innate ability changes pretty slowly. So even though we're at our peak around 20, the drop off from that point to our mid-50s, early 60s is pretty gradual. While at the same time, our increase in fluid ability is pretty sharp, right? We have a steep curve related to the increase in our fluid ability. Okay, and we get to about our maximum decision-making ability. Science shows somewhere around the age of 55. When we look at the combination of our innate ability and our fluid ability, most people top out in their decision making ability around age 55. And then the declines in our innate ability start to offset the fluid ability that we've acquired over our lifetime, and our decision quality starts to gradually trickle down. Let me tell you right now, this is a very unpopular thing to present at a financial planning conference. To Justin's point earlier, right? Got a bunch of middle-aged white guys sitting in the room, and you're sharing this information with them, and I've gotten questions like, "So you're telling me this was probably 6 or 7 years ago when I was presenting on this a lot. I had a lot less gray hair at that point in time. So you're telling me I should just hand the car keys over, right? Like I'm completely and totally unable to serve my clients well or make my own good decisions." I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the science is showing that over time, our decision-making ability is going to deteriorate. There's no ifs, ands, or bunts about it. This isn't some financial planner making this up. This is straight out of the neuroscience research that's coming down the pipe. And so with this, the way our brain works in the decision-making process starts to change. It doesn't mean that we're any less smart. It doesn't mean that we're any less experienced. What it does mean is that the emotional contributors in our brain start to have a bigger input into the decision-making process than do our rational contributors to decision-making in our brain, right? So we start to see people act a little bit less rationally as a result of that. And what it subjects people to a little bit later in life is making less than fully effective choices and being exposed potentially to being taken advantage of at a higher rate, right? As a result of this, there's reduced benefit from search, and it all happens without individuals potentially recognizing this decline in decision-making ability. Okay, and that's tough, right? It's not something that we want to come to grips with, and it's not necessarily something that's easy to recognize. But we have pretty good evidence of it, right? And so if we just look at this graph right here, related to financial literacy as measured by broad questions on different financial topics with people at different ages, and confidence, right? Starting at age 60, we see on the average financial literacy scores are significantly lower for the oldest age in the group as they are for the youngest age in the group. But confidence in financial decisions is flat or potentially even increases on the average over time. That's not a good recipe, generally speaking. We also see, if we look at the quality of decisions when making lending choices, that we have about our best decisions when it comes to borrowing money from age 29 to about age 53, right? At the peak around age 53. That's very consistent with the literature. But then over time after that, the quality of lending decisions by age starts to diminish until mid-70s or so, where we start to see a sharper decline in ability to make good lending decisions. And this could be because we don't make good decisions to begin with, or the more likely cause of this is that lenders can make salient the attributes of a loan that are more favorable for the lender. And as we age, our ability to consider the other attributes are lower. And so we naturally just make less informed decisions as a result. Same thing on effectiveness with search. right? So if we just look at the rates that people have, when we look at loans, people pay the lowest rates around age 50. Now, there's a couple of factors that go along with this. Their wealth might be higher, their credit might be better. But we can also observe that their overall financial literacy is the highest at this age, right? As to where we see the same thing on lines of credit as well. After that, we would say that, hey, listen, the experiences of these people aren't any different beyond this point. And so what's contributing to the differences in the interest rate that they're starting to make? They probably haven't completely diminished their wealth if they were wealthy. Their credit probably didn't all of a sudden suck. And so there's something happening here in decision quality as people age. Okay, and so this definitely has implications for financial choice, and the implications are somewhat paternalistic, right? We definitely see an increased value in delegating financial choice with age. All right. And we see the importance of choosing advisors well, right? And also choosing contracts that limit behavior beyond that point. Okay, so an annuity is an example of this contract. Again, not advocating necessarily for an annuity. I'm just using it as an example. But annuitization, for the most part, is an irrevocable contract. And so once I engage in that contract, or once I delegate more of my decision making to someone that is more objective in their ability to make those decisions, then it reduces the likelihood that I'll come back and reverse a decision that was beneficial to me as I age. And so there's really important considerations, especially when working with older clients, as we think about paternalism, delegation of choice, and things of that nature. Okay, and ultimately what this does is it decreases the complexity of decisions when we have the least ability to engage in a complex decision-making process. So, fun stuff. This is the last slide, just so you guys know. I'm just going to put it all up there. Okay, so what are the policy implications? Policy implications are the more we can reduce complexity of decisions, the better our interventions are likely to be. And so we can do this through contracts, we can do this through disclosure of salient information, and we can do this through restricted choice related to paternalism. Okay, all of these things are going to, in some way, form, or fashion, benefit the boundedly rational consumer without really impacting the sophisticated consumer in a negative way. Okay, so this has this Pareto efficiency component kind of built into it at some level. Now, if we start to restrict the choice of the sophisticated through regulation like this, then maybe it's not as Pareto efficient. But as long as we're not restricting the choice of the sophisticated and improving the outcomes of the naive, then this has some characteristics of the Pareto efficiency. Okay, so really thinking about how we can regulate to the benefit of the unsophisticated is good. So here's some examples, right? Impose some suitability requirements on product sales for older consumers. We do that. Increase legal liability for taking advantage of the most vulnerable populations. We do that. And then increase the importance and application of the fiduciary standard. Right? Again, if we have this standard more broadly applied, then these things kind of take care of themselves. We don't have people selling products that aren't suitable or taking advantage of people that might be most disadvantaged, whether it be because they're naive or they're older in age or whatever the case may be. Okay, so addressing this idea of less than perfect rationality is a big part of the policy creation process. Okay, get it. Told you this one would be shorter. What thoughts or questions do you have as we go through this stuff?
Only thought I had is towards the end as you were going through there, like I think a lot of these policies could be applied to older advisors as well. Like we talk mostly about clients, but I mean, my neighbor's an airline pilot at 65, he has to retire. I think the average age of a financial advisor is 55. And unfortunately, you do see that with, diminished capacity with advisors, right? Who's watching the advisors? So I think it'd be an interesting study.
That's a really interesting thought, and I bet you could do a study on that for what that's worth, based on secondary data that's publicly available. That would be really interesting to look at, and I agree with you.
What I'm taking away is that there is still a place for financial education, that it shouldn't be either or a financial advice or financial education or financial advice. What I am getting from the lectures is that you need some level of financial education to be able to even benefit the most from financial advice. So the thinking that is either financial education or financial advice, for me, it doesn't really work. It's not going to resolve the problem. People still need some level of financial education to be able to make the most out of the advice they get out of disclosures, policy intervention. So there is still a good place for financial education, and that is one of the conclusions I'm drawing from what we've discussed. So I don't know whether that conclusion is valid or not. Yeah.
No, I think that's a very valid conclusion. One of the things we know about financial education is that it's most valuable at the point of decision or close to the point of decision, right? And so when we look at like financial education in high schools, there's a lot of mixed evidence on the benefit of financial education in high schools. Now, I don't think you have anything to lose from providing financial education in high school, but the evidence is maybe suggesting that you don't have a ton to gain on the average either. But when you take that financial education and you drop it into a phase of life that's close to or at the point of decision, that financial education makes a humongous impact on the decisions that people engage with. I mean, even thinking back to the disclosure, I'm not necessarily saying disclosure equals education, but when we looked at that disclosure study in lecture 2, where we disclosed fees and returns at Harvard and the Wharton School of Business, that disclosure education about mutual funds had a big impact on how people chose the mutual funds that they selected in that experiment. And so if you provide education on, shrouded attributes and how they can impact the cost of a transaction, or if you provide some education on salient attributes and what you should be focused on to make quality decisions, those kind of things at the point of transactions and close to it has proven to be highly, highly effective. And then just an overall understanding of how does interest work? How do returns work? What is risk? And how does your exposure to risk impact your decision-making process and potentially the outcomes that you'll experience through participation in risky choices? All of that is good stuff. And so policy looking at education would likely prove significantly more effective if it was focused around decision timing.
Dr. Browning, just, emphasizing what you've said. I did a study about 2 years ago concerning the same thing, that education is not actually effective when it's done in high school. If anything, it causes overconfidence, whereby students feel that they can engage in instruments that they've just learned about without knowing the repercussions of those decisions. So it really makes sense to have financial education based on the context upon which the individual can apply that information. Now, having said that, going back to the aspect of what we've learned today, financial sophistication, actually, it's great, but I think what we've learned really focusing on the aspect of nudges, I'll call them nudges, and choice architecture. It helps those that are not financially sophisticated be geared towards making positive decisions or positive behaviors, that which would be very difficult if they had to choose for themselves. So it defaults them to something that would work out for them eventually. And looking back at, what we all deal with in bounded rationality, when it comes to the aspect of how that product or that service was framed, we also become confused even when we have the financial knowledge, because if it's not domain-based, then we become confused. For example, if even someone who has not interacted with different kinds of financial instruments, whether it's speculative from Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and then you ask them to make decisions or advice concerning that specific instrument, and yet they are not trained on it, then that limits their ability to really govern or even act in the best interest of the client. So all I'm saying is financial sophistication becomes even more complex when we are not conversant with what it takes to be able to help a client move from one decision to another. So how we frame everything also can really impact how we view the information we put across or a client brings to us to help them make decisions.
I love that, Kathy. Right. We see good evidence of that. And that's one of the things I love about the psychology of financial planning becoming to the forefront, because it really helps us think about, again, to your point, how we communicate things, because the presentation of a topic and how we frame that is going to become, at some level, how our client frames it. And it's going to affect their perception of risk, reward, and the other characteristics that are ultimately going to lead to the decision that they make. Really, really good stuff. I'll use annuities again as an example. We did a study where we just looked at annuities framed as an investment or annuities framed as insurance, right? Well, investment has risk, insurance equals protection. And the exact same product with two different words in the presentation of that product completely changed how people chose in the experiment that we looked at. Investment, no thank you, I will pass. The chances of me losing my money are really good. Protection, I think I'll have some of that. The propensity to participate went up drastically just based on a basic framing. All right, guys, any other questions or thoughts about today's discussion or anything that we've discussed thus far in the class? All right, well, let's talk about this midterm a little bit. So I'm going to post the midterm here in just a bit. It's just going to be a Word document, right? So you'll download the Word document, and when you download that document, what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to provide the answers that you create in that document. And then I would just like for you to upload the document back to the submission portal. All right, so you won't actually input anything on Blackboard. It'll just simply be downloading the test, completing the test, and then submitting the completed version. Estimations on time, I'm going to give you from when I open the exam until 11:59 p.m. tomorrow night. My guess is this will take you somewhere in the ballpark of 2.5 to 4 hours. So it's not going to be completely and totally overwhelming. from a time perspective, but I would plan my time accordingly to answer that. All short answer questions. Some of the questions that I sometimes get when I say short answer are how many words equal short answer in your brain, Dr. Browning. I would think that you could fully answer all of these questions in less than 250 words. So I'd say somewhere between 100 to 250 words at the maximum. Don't try to hit 250 on all of them, because if you do, you'll be rambling. And so somewhere between 100 to 250 words based on the question will definitely fully answer these questions. And again, just remember 250, I would be like, man, that is a long answer in these short answers. So that's kind of the boundary that you can work within. Trying to think if there's anything else that I commonly get.
When will you have our grades, do you think?
So exam turns in tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. I probably won't have them until Monday of next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
So for resources that we can use, can we use like all the recording slides, the notes, like Google AI? Where do we get restricted or not?
Yeah, I mean, here's the reality, and I'm gonna come straight out and say it because you guys aren't ignorant. You could probably put a lot of these questions into AI, and AI would do a pretty good job answering them. And so I'll just put it out there. My use of AI recommendation, because I'm not going to be able to keep you from doing it, is that if you plan to use AI, I would use it post answer, right? And so I would use it from the perspective of, okay, this is what I think the answer is. What am I missing? Clean up my response, right? Because the reality is you have to understand this stuff. You're going to get to a qualifying exam, and there's going to be no AI. And if I ask you to prove your understanding of this topic, and you don't have any practice proving your understanding, then you're putting yourself at risk of underperforming when good performance is the most valuable. So that's my thoughts on this. I'll tell you really quickly. I was part of my first dissertation defense that was undoubtedly, well, or not defense, proposal, that was undoubtedly fully AI generated. The document was beautiful. The way the document was written was beautiful. It made a lot of sense. We asked that student questions about their research, and the student could not justify or defend their research. And so while it made a pretty document, it resulted in the first failed proposal that I've seen in a really long time. And so just know that those are the trade-offs. And what I would recommend is whatever allows you to produce a high quality product where you can justify and defend every line of your response is a great response. But if you can't justify and defend every line of the response that you provide, then you're selling yourself short. So just make sure that that's a differentiator in how you decide to use those types of tools.
Thanks. That's good enough.
You bet.
I can switch gears real quickly.
Sure.
On our presentations, is there an opportunity to use some breakout rooms in Zoom? Do you have that ability?
I can use breakout rooms.
Okay, perfect. That's all I needed.
Yes, sir.
And I guess, yeah, we won't. So yeah, Justin, you and Kathy will have it. So again, it should be however many slides to fill at least 35-ish minutes so that we're able to address a couple questions afterwards as well. And then you talked about an outline. I think you had said you were going to talk a little bit more about that, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about it. I'm glad you're thinking ahead. I'm going to provide an example for you guys so that you'll have concrete evidence of what I'm talking about here. So for slide length, I mean, this is going to be a crapshoot. my guess is you're gonna be anywhere from 15 to 25. Depending on how you structure your slides and the type of presentation style you have, right? Literally in the first hour of our class, and we talked about some questions, I covered one slide. And so that's just my presentation style. But I think you'll end up somewhere in that ballpark. What I don't want is anything that's difficult to digest from the audience perspective. So I don't want a bunch of slides that don't add to my understanding of a topic, that have too many words just to feel like you covered everything. I want you to digest the material to the point to where you have a good understanding and you can present your understanding to the audience, not necessarily present everything that was in your article as a rewrite through a PowerPoint presentation. In terms of the two-page outline, yeah, again, the way I think about this particular outline, the example that I gave you earlier was more related to your own research outline. The way I think about these outlines is, what information would I want if I was using this article as a source in a response to a qualifying exam question, right? So from that perspective, you're really going into this article and you're saying, after really digesting this article, if I had to condense it into 2 pages and say, here's my outline, right? Where, this was really important and this topic was really important, and here are the highlights from these important components of this article. You can condense that down in a way that everyone can reference it and gain a quick understanding of the outline. Now, to your previous question, Nick, I do think that AI could be quite effective on the outline, right? And so you could go in potentially, and as you're creating your presentation, take all of your notes and all that kind of stuff like that. Then you could dump the article and your notes into AI and say, produce me a 2-page outcome of the most important topics out of this that makes understanding this content easy for a secondary user. And you'll get a really nice outline. The purpose of this is not necessarily to demonstrate your understanding. The purpose of the 2-page outline is to provide a resource to your classmates who aren't presenting on this article, that allows them a quick reference point to go back and get familiar with the key concepts out of the reading.
That's awesome to know. So it's also due the day of our presentation, or do we need to have that for our peers the day of the presentation?
Yeah, so I want you to turn that in at the exact same time. The due date for the presentation and the outline is the beginning of class on the day in which you present.
Okay.
Professor, do you want the references cited? So if you want me to define maybe cost theorem, do you want me to cite the original article? Do you want something like that for the exam?
For this exam, no. Right? These are going to be pretty straightforward, quick hitter questions. For the final exam, I will want references for the response that you provide.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
You bet. Anything else? All right. Well, I'm going to release the exam. Okay. If you dig into that bad boy and you have questions, definitely reach out and let me know. I'm happy to help with that, but you'll have approximately 48 hours, or not 48. You'll have approximately 36 hours to knock this bad boy out. And Justin, to your comment earlier, a preliminary thank you to the people that got dealt the unfortunate hand of Thursday presentations. I will say the Thursday presentations are probably the shortest articles. And so that's my reward back to you.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, you bet, guys. Holler if I can help in any way. Good luck on the exam.
Mine is pretty long. I saw the pages. It scared me, but
Well, don't take it. All right, it's the luck of the draw. You lost in Vegas.
Thank you, sir.
All right, you guys have a good day. I'll see you on Thursday.
Professor Browning, sorry, I was just going to ask one other question. If
Yeah.
you were in our shoes and preparing for both the midterm or the final, what would you say would be the best way to prepare? Like, what would you just, when you open up the exam, have, the slides, or what would you say would be the best way?
Man, if I was doing it, I would open up that midterm and I would read all the questions. And I would answer the ones, I would attempt to answer all of them. Right? And in your attempt to answer, you're going to figure out real quick what you understand and what you don't understand. And so once I did that, then I would go back to recorded lectures, slides, whatever, and really start to bridge the gap for those things that I don't understand.
Love it. Thanks. That's
Yeah,
good.
you bet.
Okay. Sorry to
Thank
cut
you,
you.
sir.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
No, you bet. Okay, guys, y'all have a great day. We'll see you Thursday.